Hello, I'm Ellen Vince, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and boy, is that true today. And see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's August 7th, 2024.
Yeah, an incredible subject this week. But firstly, let's say welcome back to Ellen. And you've had some wonderful news, haven't you?
Yes, I have been missing you, Clive, because I've been in Arizona with my new grandbaby.
Yeah.
My daughter had a little girl on July 23rd, and I could hop on a plane out there and help her out for a while as she adjusted, and baby brother and dad adjusted too. So it was really a fun trip. Quite hot out there.
I can imagine. My goodness.
110, 114. Yeah.
Wow.
So back in the Midwest.
Very, very precious moment. So
yes,
many
precious.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So to our subject this week. This week, we turn our attention to what is one of the most urgent and horrifying catastrophes that I personally think has stirred our hearts so far. And this is the little-known unfolding famine and genocide in Darfur. Darfur, that's the conflict-torn region of Western Sudan, is now witnessing extreme food shortages, with many people resorting to eating leaves and soil. Acute malnutrition rates have surpassed critical thresholds, particularly among children under 5 years old. Satellite imagery has shown a significant increase in cemetery sizes, indicating a rise in starvation-related deaths, while attacks on healthcare facilities in the major regional city of Fasher have left millions with no or very limited access to medical care.
It's horrible.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really sad that we're not hearing about this. But, I think first we should talk about, what do we actually mean when we talk about famine? What are the parameters that define a famine? And famine is defined as being an extreme scarcity of food that affects a wide geographic area and causes widespread malnutrition, starvation, and increased mortality. Specifically, the United Nations World Food Program declares a famine when widespread malnutrition exists and people have started dying of starvation due to lack of access to sufficient, nutritious food. And the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System defines famine, Phase 5, as occurring when all three of these criteria are met simultaneously. At least 20% of households in an area face extreme food shortages with limited ability to cope. Acute malnutrition prevalence in children exceeds 30%, and the death rate exceeds 2 people per 10,000 people per day. Famines are distinct from general food shortages or periods of hunger. They represent catastrophic hunger crises where large populations face extreme food scarcity, leading to widespread malnutrition, disease, and significantly increased mortality rates. It's important to note that famines are not inevitable or purely caused by natural disasters, natural cycles, or climate change. They're often predictable and preventable, resulting from a combination of factors including conflict, climate shocks, poverty, and policy failures. This seems to be the case in Darfur, which most commentators recognize as being a man-made disaster. Makes it even more tragic.
It does. It does. Yeah. And I think it's really bringing home here that when we use this word famine, it's a very, very serious situation. really, it's not a word that's used lightly. There are many places in the world where drought is causing mass starvation, but clearly these criteria indicate the severity of what's happening.
And I didn't realize there were these specific parameters and definitions to it. I
No,
thought it just kind of meant where people were struggling to find food.
exactly. No, it's really seemingly quite precisely defined.
Yes.
Yeah. So what is happening in Darfur? The situation there, specifically North Darfur, has reached a critical point with famine conditions officially, as we've said, being declared as affecting at least one area last week. On 1st of August, the IPC Famine Review Committee, which is a team of leading independent international food security, nutrition, and mortality experts, confirmed, on the basis of what they describe as being reasonable evidence, that communities in North Darfur state, notably in the Zamzam camp, which is near the state capital, El Fasher, have moved into a state of famine. So this is this phase 5, this extreme phase 5 we mentioned. Zamzam camp is the largest camp for internally displaced people in the country. This is the first determination, again, this brings home how serious this is, the first determination of famine in more than 7 years, and only the third time a famine determination has been made since this monitoring or classification system was created 20 years ago. Previous famines occurred in Somalia back in 2011 and in South Sudan, both in the same area, in 2017. Due to restricted humanitarian access, it is difficult to establish with certainty that famine conditions are or aren't present in other areas of Sudan. However, it's likely that other displaced persons camps in North Darfur especially, as well as in areas of Greater Darfur and Khartoum, are also facing famine, including in the camps at Abu Shuk and Al Salam. Back in May, the World Food Programme reported that it believed at least 1.7 million people were already experiencing emergency levels of hunger in Darfur. In speaking about the gravity of the humanitarian situation on the ground, and in what we might hope will be a strong wake-up call to the world, Clementine Naquita Salami, who is the UN's resident and humanitarian coordinator in Sudan, said that the people of Sudan have suffered relentlessly since conflict broke out there more than 15 months ago. This is, she says, a man-made crisis, one which can be resolved if all parties and stakeholders uphold their responsibilities and commitments to the populations in desperate need. The humanitarian community in Sudan has been ringing the alarm about the unfolding hunger catastrophe and the risk of famine while conflict has raged on, causing displacement, disrupting basic services, destroying livelihoods, and severely restricting humanitarian access. And the US Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, said that the IPC report confirms what was known already, that people have been and continue to die in Sudan from starvation. She said, families who fled horrific violence have been going hungry for months. Children have been eating dirt and leaves, and every day babies have been starving to death. Around 320,000 people have fled the escalating conflict in the capital of North Darfur, which, as we mentioned, is El Fasher, since May. The Zamzam camp houses approximately 220,000 of these displaced individuals. It lies just a few miles south of the city, which itself is the last significant holdout against the RSF in Darfur. And that city is itself home to 1.8 million people, and it has effectively been held under siege by the RSF now for several months. More generally, the United Nations further warns that around half the country's population, that's around 25 million people, are at crisis levels of food insecurity or worse. And tragically, the famine conditions in North Darfur are expected to continue until at least October this year.
Oh, my word. So, what is causing the current famine? And there seems to be three main factors that are the primary contributors to the famine. The first is the ongoing conflict. The conflict between the Sudanese military and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, that's the RSF, which broke out in April last year, has undoubtedly accelerated the onset of famine. CNN reports that Darfur is now also facing a genocide, including the targeting of the Masalit ethnic group and other non-Arab communities by the RSF. The UN says that the 15-month conflict has left more than 14,000 people dead and displaced more than 8 million others. At least 130 people were killed in El Fasher last month after RSF fighters encircled the town. And last week, North Darfur's main hospital in that same city was also forced to close after the RSF raided the facility and looted vital supplies. In April, the United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Alice Warimu Naderitu, warned of prevailing signs of genocide and grave human rights violations and abuses in the country, which bear a similar pattern to the systemic ethnic cleansing that took place in the early 2000s. The United Arab Emirates, an ally of the USA and UK, is accused by some to be supporting the RSF, although it denies this claim. While intense and widespread clashes between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces in Darfur persist, food supplies and humanitarian aid delivery will continue to be severely disrupted. As World Food Program Executive Director Cindy McCain explains, we urgently need a massive expansion of humanitarian access so we can halt the famine that has taken hold in North Darfur and stop it sweeping across Sudan. The warring parties must lift all restrictions and open new supply routes across borders and across conflict lines so relief agencies can get to cut-off communities with desperately needed food and other humanitarian aid.
These are strong words from people on the ground that really see what's going on. It really is trying to sound this wake-up call.
Yeah.
And
terrible.
It is terrible. We might also note the displacement of people is a further major cause of the famine. The conflict alone, which has been going on now for 15 months, has resulted in the largest internal displacement crisis globally. So that's bigger than any other conflict, with over 10 million people being displaced since the war broke out. And also, as we said, there is this restricted access for those who would want to bring humanitarian aid, which is worsening the catastrophe. Again, with the major city of El Fasher being under siege and preventing aid reaching the camps. So what challenges are being faced in response to the famine? This problem of restricted humanitarian access is a real key challenge. Relief Web notes that aid workers are facing major difficulty accessing the areas where their help is needed, including facing live conflict, insecurity, and systematic obstructions, such as being deliberately denied access to where they would want to go. The ongoing rainy season is further constraining access. The only cross-border route available for humanitarian movements between Chad into Darfur, the Tina crossing, is currently largely impassable due to flooding. And movement across the conflict lines to parts of Khartoum, Darfur, and elsewhere has been severely restricted, in some cases being cut off for many months. While the UN Security Council has condemned the fighting, the international response to the conflict, such as in deploying protective missions and the US imposition of sanctions by the United States on key RSM commanders, has been limited. Yona Diamond told CNN that the international response does not come close to meeting the scale of the world's largest man-made humanitarian disaster. Strong words again.
Oh, yes.
And rightly so. And UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan, Clementine Nakrita Salami, stresses that donors must urgently scale up their financial support and apply diplomatic pressure to push for an opening up of humanitarian access. Refugees International's Director for Africa, Asia and the Middle East, Daniel P. Sullivan, who wrote a very good article on this, urges robust diplomatic efforts to push the warring parties to reach a ceasefire and stay true to their stated commitments to allow access for humanitarian aid. He says that the delivery of aid from Sudan's neighbors, including Chad and South Sudan, must be allowed urgently, without waiting for the Sudanese army forces' approval, which I found this incredible, to date has been allowed by the UN to restrict cross-border aid delivery. Sullivan also advocates ramping up funding for emergency response rooms and other local Sudanese mutual aid groups, which are on the front line in delivering humanitarian aid.
So, how is the world responding? Global response to the crisis is focused on the immediate humanitarian response needs and also continuing to broker a ceasefire between the warring generals, with the war widely being seen as a primary aggravator of the famine, of course. So the humanitarian response as of October 1st, the Sudan Humanitarian Appeal, which is seeking $2.7 billion, was just 32% funded. The monitoring organization Famine Early Warning Systems Network said last week that it is known that starvation is widespread among displaced populations in Fasher, where around 500,000 people are currently sheltering, adding that without an end to this conflict and in the absence of large-scale humanitarian food assistance, extreme human suffering will persist. More generally, several United Nations agencies and other relief organizations are working across the country, including the World Food Program, which has been actively involved in providing food and cash assistance to displaced and vulnerable communities. UNICEF, which has delivered life-saving, ready-to-use therapeutic food to treat severely malnourished children and has set up numerous outpatient therapeutic programs across Sudan, and the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is delivering life-saving seeds for the main planting season to help avert future food shortages, although urgently requiring additional funding to meet the needs of their famine prevention program.
And I imagine that the severe weather conditions at the moment are making it very hard to actually, for the harvests, essentially, for growing, not to mention the conflict itself. So ceasefire talks, efforts are being made and have been made, as we mentioned in previous episodes, to negotiate a ceasefire, with talks scheduled in Switzerland involving representatives from the Sudanese army and the RSF next week, these being brokered by the United States and Saudi Arabia, and with the African Union, Egypt, the UAE also participating, and the UN acting as observers. Last month in Geneva, the RSF committed to facilitating humanitarian aid deliveries, strengthening civilian protection measures, and ensuring the safe passage of individuals and supplies. The African Union has also sought at various times to broker a ceasefire, again, as we've mentioned in a previous episode. The latest US and Saudi-led talks in Geneva, which start on the 14th of August next week, will focus on the delivery of humanitarian aid, achieving ceasefires, and paving the way towards a permanent cessation of aggression. Efforts to broker peace so far have been unsuccessful. Notably, the Jeddah Declaration of Commitment to Protect Civilians that was passed last year was designed to end the conflict, but neither side has committed to honouring its objectives. Looking forward, without a resolution to the conflict and a substantial increase in humanitarian aid, the situation is likely to deteriorate. The upcoming ceasefire talks and increased funding and support for local aid groups are critical steps towards ending or at least mitigating this terrible crisis.
So, where is it possible to donate? There are several reputable organizations accepting donations to help address the humanitarian crisis in Darfur and Sudan. If you feel moved to donate toward food, water, and medical aid and are able to, these organizations are actively working in the region and have established channels to provide aid to those affected by the crisis. And we'll include links in the show notes. Among aid organizations accepting online donations are CARE International, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, CAFOD, UNICEF, the International Rescue Committee, and the UN Refugee Agency. You may wish to look carefully at where your money will go.
Yeah. I have personal experience of that, looking at these websites. I won't mention which one, just for everyone to be led as they feel led. But one of them I looked at gave a statement of where your money will go. And it was something like $150 will buy food for 4 families. And I thought, my goodness, how much of this money is actually going directly to where it needs to go,
Yeah.
to an organization?
Yeah.
So I didn't give to that particular organization, I have to say. But everyone will be led in the right
Yes.
direction. And it's a shame. What would really be good, and if anybody knows this, I'd suggest putting it in the Facebook group, and we can perhaps share this more widely, how to reach these local emergency organizations. The people on the ground are the ones
Yes.
really are going to be able to have most, be most effective, I think. But I certainly couldn't find online, at least. I guess they don't have access to the internet in the main. They're not geared up like the big organizations to accept donations.
Right.
But if anybody knows people on the ground, actually, how we can get to those, that's going to be very useful to
Yeah.
know.
Put something in the Facebook page if you have an inside scoop.
Exactly. So where might we focus our prayers? Relief Web appeals to 3 main audiences to play their part in bringing the catastrophe to an end. And we might be inspired to offer our prayers for each of these. Firstly, the conflicting parties themselves, urging all parties in the conflict, particularly the Sudanese army and the RSF, to strictly adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, which includes ceasing all attacks against what they describe as objects necessary to food production and to people's livelihoods, such as looting, which has been going on, agricultural assets, and markets. Reinstating the currently closed Adre crossing with Chad, which would offer the shortest and most reliable route for delivering humanitarian aid to the worst affected areas, to creating and maintaining humanitarian corridors into Darfur and other regions of the country, and introducing emergency measures to ease bureaucratic and administrative procedures for the period of the famine response, including removing all restrictions on the transfer of medical supplies, food, and nutrition commodities, and replacement of cumbersome permits and project-level agreements. And I think we might also add there the UN not supporting this need for approval through the current military for aid transfer. That seems crazy to me. Secondly, a second audience, as it were, that Relief Web suggests focusing on are the country-based humanitarian community, urging funding to be prioritized to cash programs such as the multi-purpose cash assistance and group cash transfers, as this approach quickly addresses food and other basic needs in the worst affected areas. Enhancing UN coordination efforts to scale up the cash response, including facilitating effective partnerships between UN agencies and the key cash actors in Sudan, and increasing funding, this is what we were saying earlier, to local actors, including the emergency response rooms and women-led organizations here, recognizing the disproportionate impact of the conflict on women and girls. And this would include a program for sexual and reproductive health protection and against gender-based violence. Finally, it appeals to diplomats and donors, stressing the need for the international community to scale up its efforts to bring about an end to the hostilities, address barriers to scaling up the humanitarian response, and accelerating coordinated diplomatic efforts to push for unfettered humanitarian access using all cross-line and cross-border routes from Chad and South Sudan. And as areas for focusing our prayers and intentions, we might add to these heightening public visibility of the crisis. We were saying before that, my goodness, 30 years ago, the whole world was motivated. Yes, it was down to the likes of Bob Geldof and a few who really inspired the world to what was going on, and seeing this actually covered in the news, actually seeing images of what famine really looks like, move the world. So really heightening visibility of the crisis through increased media exposure and campaigning. I thought this was an interesting reflection by the international human rights lawyer Yona Diamond, who told CNN, every major news outlet has dedicated an ongoing slot to Gaza and Ukraine, with only ad hoc coverage for Sudan. There is no reason why a conflict impacting a greater number of civilians, threatening millions with death by starvation and an ongoing genocide, do not receive the same attention. He remarked that the lack of attention hinders humanitarian efforts, pointing out that while Gaza and Ukraine have each received about 30% of their humanitarian response plans, the 25 million people in Sudan who urgently need help have received only about half of that amount.
Well, and the pressure on those who on the conflict isn't happening either.
No.
As it is in Gaza, and between Israel and Hamas. So
exactly. It's kind of poodling along, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a better word. There's not the pressure there. Now, while we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, we might will that the intelligence services, who probably do have a big role to play in this, and also the foreign offices of influential countries, of any nations that are supplying arms to the RSF, will be applying diplomatic pressure and being guided there by reliable intelligence. Now, potentially, we don't know this, potentially this might include the USA and its allies applying pressure on the UAE, if it is indeed among rich nations who are supplying the RSF with weapons, as some claim is the case. And of course, we might will for a ceasefire, one that is permanent and even more immediately ahead of negotiations that might bring about that end, for safe corridors to be provided for aid agencies to be able to supply aid for and reach those most in need, including to the Zamzam camp and settlements that are under siege. Let us will that real progress will be made, and that any commitments made by all parties attending the talks in Geneva next week will be honoured.
And may it be so. So the special focus for intention that we're suggesting for this week, as Sudan is moving dangerously towards another genocide, while the largely man-made famine affecting Darfur is expected to bring starvation to millions, the world's response in the coming months will be crucial in determining an end to both the conflict and the unconscionable humanitarian crisis that it has to date failed to properly address. We then suggest us holding as our main focus for this week. We will that all attending the peace talks in Geneva next week will resolve a permanent, committed end to the conflict in Darfur, including allowing effective and immediate protection for aid workers and delivery vehicles to reach all who are affected by the famine there. Please join us in holding this. That about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's Daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out, too, for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Vince and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.